After her husband kicked her out for spilling coffee on his mistress, she sold bread to survive until a billionaire fell in love with her, unaware she owned the company. Behind his $70 billion deal, he invited her to his mistress's baby shower and was crushed by her return. The coffee splashed across the designer dress in slow motion, and everything changed. Her husband didn't ask if it was an accident. He demanded she leave their home immediately, choosing his mistress over his wife in front of a room full of guests who would never forget what they witnessed. She walked out with nothing but the clothes on her back, her credit cards frozen by mourning, her social circle vanishing like smoke, but she refused to beg or break. The bread she began selling from a small street corner became her lifeline, each loaf needed with the strength she was rebuilding inside herself, though no one from her former life would lower themselves to see what she had become. Then a billionaire stopped at her stand, not because he pitied her, but because something in her eyes told a story he needed to understand, and his curiosity turned to fascination, then to something neither of them expected. She never told him about the company she owned, the corporate empire hidden behind layers of trusts and legal structures that made her invisible to everyone who had dismissed her, including the ex-husband now celebrating the biggest deal of his career. When the invitation arrived, thick cardstock announcing his mistress's baby shower in embossed gold lettering, she held it in trembling hands, reading between every carefully chosen word the real message. They wanted to parade their victory in front of her defeated face. But he had no idea that the company behind his $70 billion deal, the one entity that could approve or destroy everything he'd worked for, answered to the woman he'd thrown away like garbage. What happens when a man who kicked his wife out for spilling coffee on his mistress discovers she holds his entire future in her hands? Will the woman who survived by selling bread use her hidden power to crush him? Or will her transformation into something he can no longer recognize be revenge enough? Dear viewers, this story will take you on an emotional journey that teaches profound lessons about resilience, hidden strength, and the danger of judging people by their circumstances. You'll learn how true power isn't always visible, how underestimating others reveals more about our own character than theirs, and why dignity in hardship builds something money can never buy. By the end, you'll understand that the greatest revenge isn't destruction. It's becoming so powerful that those who hurt you can no longer touch who you've become. Drop in the comments what lessons struck you most deeply and what you would have done differently if you were in her shoes during those bread-selling days. Subscribe for more captivating stories that entertain, inspire, and teach life-changing lessons about redemption, justice, and the strength we never know we have until we're forced to use it. The charity gala had been perfect until it wasn't. Jennifer stood in the corner of their penthouse living room, watching her husband Richard laugh with the woman whose hand lingered too long on his arm. But she told herself it meant nothing because admitting the truth would shatter everything she'd built her identity around. The cup trembled in her grip, expensive porcelain filled with coffee she'd stopped drinking an hour ago, now cold and bitter. But her hands wouldn't stop shaking because she'd just seen a text message on Richard's phone that confirmed what her gut had been screaming for months. She turned toward the kitchen, trying to escape before anyone noticed the tears building behind her practiced smile. But her heel caught on the Persian rug her mother-in-law had insisted they buy, and the cup tilted forward in a moment that would define the rest of her life. The coffee arced through the air and landed across the cream-colored dress of Vanessa Hartley, Richard's assistant, his mistress, the woman who'd been slowly replacing Jennifer in every aspect of his life except the legal paperwork. The scream that came from Vanessa's mouth was theatrical, performative, designed for maximum impact, but the look on Richard's face was something Jennifer had never seen before. Pure, undiluted rage directed entirely at his wife. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his fingers wrapping around Jennifer's wrist with a pressure that would leave bruises, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the words that came next, delivered in a voice cold enough to freeze the champagne, still bubbling in crystal flutes around the room. "Get out of my house," Richard said, loud enough for every guest to hear, clear enough that there could be no misunderstanding. "Pack nothing. Take nothing. Just leave before you embarrass me more than you already have." Jennifer opened her mouth to explain it was an accident, to apologize, to somehow fix what was breaking apart. But he turned away from her before she could form words. His attention already back on Vanessa, whose tears looked genuine, but whose eyes held a triumph. Jennifer recognized too late. The guests parted like a sea as Jennifer walked toward the door, their faces a mixture of shock and pity and something worse. Relief that the drama was happening to someone else, not to them, giving them a story to tell at brunches for months to come. She stood on the sidewalk outside the building she'd called home for 6 years, the doorman who usually greeted her warmly, now avoiding eye contact as if her failure was contagious, but she still had her phone and her wallet and her cards, so she told herself everything would be manageable once the shock wore off. The hotel 3 blocks away had a lobby she'd walked through 100 times for charity meetings, but when she tried to check in, her credit card was declined, and then the second one, and then the third, the desk clerk's expression shifting from professional courtesy to suspicious judgment. Jennifer pulled out her phone to call her best friend Rachel, but the call went straight to voicemail, and so did the next 5 calls to people she'd considered family. Their silence louder than any words could ever be. By midnight, she was sitting in a 24-hour diner with a cup of coffee she couldn't afford to refill, watching the night manager eye her like she might try to sleep in the booth, but her mind was racing through possibilities that were shrinking by the minute. A text message arrived from Richard's lawyer, formal, clinical, devastating, explaining that all joint accounts had been frozen pending their separation proceedings, that she was not to return to the residence, that any personal belongings would be inventoried and made available through legal channels. The attached documents showed how thoroughly he'd planned this moment, how every financial thread of her life had been woven through systems he controlled, but there was one thing the lawyers didn't know about. One asset her late father had placed in a trust so complex that even Jennifer sometimes forgot it existed. She'd inherited controlling interest in Meridian Holdings when her father died 7 years ago, but the company operated under layers of subsidiary names and international registrations that made her ownership invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. Richard had dismissed it during their marriage as your father's old business stuff, never bothering to understand that Meridian controlled infrastructure development contracts across 4 continents, never imagining that his wife's inheritance paperwork represented billions in real assets. Jennifer sat in that diner booth until dawn, watching the city wake up through fingerprinted windows, but she wasn't planning her comeback yet. She was just trying to figure out how to survive the next 24 hours because power on paper meant nothing when you couldn't afford breakfast. The morning sun found her walking through a neighborhood she'd driven past but never really seen, where small businesses were opening their metal gates and the smell of fresh bread cut through the exhaust fumes and yesterday's garbage. She stopped in front of a small bakery, watching the owner arrange loaves in the window with hands that knew their craft. But what caught her attention was the "Help Wanted" sign taped to the door. The letters slightly faded, as if it had been there a long time. Jennifer pushed the door open, the bell chiming above her head, and asked the question that would begin her transformation. "Are you still hiring?" The owner looked at her expensive dress, her designer shoes, her manicured nails that had never touched manual labor, but something in Jennifer's eyes must have convinced her because she nodded slowly and said, "Can you start tomorrow morning at 4?" The alarm clock screamed at 3:30 a.m., dragging Jennifer from a sleep so thin it barely qualified as rest, but she forced herself out of the narrow bed in the studio apartment she'd rented with the last cash advance she could pull from a card Richard hadn't found yet. Her hands were already blistered from yesterday's shift, the skin raw and angry from kneading dough for 12 straight hours, but she wrapped them in bandages and told herself that pain was just weakness, leaving the body, even though she knew that was something people said when they'd never actually suffered. The bakery owner, Margaret Chen, had been kind but firm during that first week, showing Jennifer once how to fold the dough, then expecting perfection by the third attempt. But the work was honest in a way Jennifer's previous life had never been, each loaf a tangible result of effort rather than appearance. By the second week, Jennifer's body had begun adapting to the rhythm of pre-dawn work, her muscles learning the motions that Margaret's hands had known for 40 years. But her mind still wandered to the life she'd lost every time she passed a store window displaying dresses she used to buy without checking price tags. The other bakery workers treated her with cautious curiosity. They could tell she didn't belong in this world, could sense the secret story behind her presence, but they respected that she showed up on time and didn't complain when flour dusted her hair or when the ovens turned the kitchen into a furnace. Margaret watched Jennifer more closely than the others, her eyes holding questions she never asked aloud, but there was something in the older woman's silence that felt like understanding rather than judgment. On a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Richard had thrown her out, Margaret approached Jennifer during the brief lull between the morning rush and lunch prep, her weathered hands holding a small envelope that looked both official and personal. "My nephew owns a corner spot 2 blocks from here," Margaret said, her accent thickening the way it did when she was nervous about something. "He's moving his newsstand to a better location, but the permit is still good for street vending. He'll rent it to you cheap if you want to sell bread on your own." Jennifer's first instinct was to refuse. She was barely surviving as an employee, couldn't imagine the risk of going independent. But Margaret continued before she could speak. "You have something my other workers don't. They love baking, but you need it. That hunger makes better bread than any recipe I could teach you." The street corner became Jennifer's kingdom by the end of that week. A folding table covered with a clean white cloth, displaying loaves she'd baked in Margaret's kitchen during off hours, each one wrapped in paper she'd stamped with a simple logo she'd designed on a library computer. The first day brought 3 customers and barely enough revenue to cover the permit fee, but Jennifer stood at that corner from 6 a.m. until 2 p.m., refusing to pack up early, refusing to let the disinterest of passers-by convince her she'd made a mistake. Rain came on Thursday, soaking through the canvas tarp she'd rigged above her table, but she stood there anyway, protecting the bread with her own jacket, and a businessman in an expensive suit stopped, not because he wanted bread, but because the sight of her determination in the downpour was so unusual, it demanded acknowledgement. "You're getting soaked," the man said, his voice carrying an authority that came from years of being listened to, but his eyes held genuine concern rather than the condescension Jennifer had learned to recognize. She looked up at him, really looked, and saw someone probably a decade older than Richard, with silver threading through dark hair and a face that showed character earned through challenges rather than inherited through privilege. "The bread stays dry, that's what matters," Jennifer replied. Surprised by how steady her voice sounded, how much she meant those words. The man smiled, something shifting in his expression that Jennifer couldn't quite read, but he bought 2 loaves and left a tip that was triple the asking price, and when she tried to return the excess, he simply said, "Quality deserves fair compensation," before disappearing into the rain. He came back the next day, and the day after that, and soon Jennifer realized he was walking 4 blocks out of his way from the financial district to buy bread he could get anywhere. But their conversations grew longer each morning, ranging from surface pleasantries to deeper discussions about resilience and reinvention and the strange freedom that came from losing everything. His name was Thomas Wellington, though he introduced himself simply as Tom, and Jennifer learned he'd built his investment empire from nothing after his own divorce had stripped him of the tech company he'd founded. But he never asked about her past, never pushed for the story behind why a woman with her obvious education and bearing was selling bread from a street corner. She appreciated his restraint, but more than that, she appreciated that he looked at her like she was someone worth knowing, not someone worth pitying. 6 weeks into her bread-selling venture, Jennifer's Corner had developed a small but loyal following. People who came not just for the quality of her baking, but for the brief human connection she offered with each transaction. But she still kept her business registered under her mother's maiden name, still paid cash for everything, still avoided anywhere her former social circle might appear. Tom had become a constant in her new life, his morning visits extending from 5 minutes to 20, then to invitations for coffee after she packed up her table. But Jennifer held back from the intimacy she could feel building between them, terrified that getting close to someone meant giving them power to hurt her again. He sensed her walls but didn't force them down, instead offering a patience that felt revolutionary compared to Richard's constant demands for her to be someone she wasn't. Then one morning, Tom's expression was different. Excited, almost boyish, as he approached her table carrying a newspaper folded to the business section. "I have to tell you something," he said, his usual composure cracking slightly. "I've been building up the courage for weeks, but I need you to know that my interest in you has nothing to do with bread." Jennifer's heart hammered against her ribs, but before she could respond, he continued, "I'm falling in love with who you are, your strength, your grace, the way you've built something from nothing without losing your humanity. I don't know what put you on this corner, and I don't care. I just know I've never met anyone like you." The words landed in Jennifer's chest like stones, heavy with meaning, but she saw in his eyes something she'd stopped believing existed. Someone who valued her for her character, rather than her usefulness. What Tom didn't know, what nobody except Margaret and the trust lawyers knew, was that Jennifer had spent her evenings in public libraries, rebuilding her connection to Meridian Holdings, learning that the company her father had built was now the silent partner in infrastructure deals that shaped cities and economies. The quarterly reports she accessed through encrypted passwords showed assets that had grown exponentially since her father's death, but more importantly, they showed that Meridian was currently negotiating final approval on a massive infrastructure development deal, a $70 billion project that would reshape the Eastern Seaboard's transportation networks. And the lead developer seeking Meridian's approval, the man whose entire career now depended on a signature from the holding company he'd never bothered to research thoroughly, was Richard Patterson, her ex-husband, who still had no idea that the wife he'd discarded for spilling coffee was the invisible force behind his biggest professional achievement. Jennifer hadn't decided what to do with that power yet, hadn't determined whether revenge was worth compromising the person she was becoming, but the choice was stolen from her when a cream-colored envelope arrived at her apartment, addressed in calligraphy that screamed expensive taste and cruel intention. The invitation inside announced a baby shower for Vanessa Hartley, hosted by Richard Patterson, and the note, paper clipped to it, carried Richard's handwriting. "Despite everything, we'd like you to share in our joy. We're starting a family, and we hope you found peace with how things worked out. No hard feelings." Jennifer's hands trembled as she read those words, understanding exactly what they meant. This was their final victory lap, their chance to show her that they'd won completely, that she'd been erased and replaced and forgotten. But sitting on her kitchen counter was a different kind of envelope, one that had arrived that same day from Meridian's legal team, requesting her formal approval on the Patterson Infrastructure Development Project, pending her signature as majority stakeholder and final authority. Jennifer looked between the two envelopes, understanding that the universe had just handed her a choice that would define not just her future, but the person she would become. Tom's words echoed. Jennifer stood in the small conference room of Meridian Holdings' discreet legal office, surrounded by attorneys who knew her as Elena Morrison, the name listed on all trust documents, a protective identity her father had established decades ago to shield his family from the spotlight that came with corporate power. The lawyers had laid out the Patterson Infrastructure Development Project in excruciating detail, $70 billion worth of highways, bridges, and transportation hubs that would cement Richard's reputation as one of the most successful developers on the East Coast. But every page required her signature, her approval, her consent to make his dream a reality. She'd been stalling for 2 weeks, requesting additional environmental impact studies and financial projections she didn't actually need, buying time to decide who she wanted to be when this story finally ended. "Miss Morrison, we need a decision by the end of this week," the lead attorney said, his tone respectful but firm, understanding that delayed approval was costing everyone money. Mr. Patterson's team is growing anxious about the timeline, and frankly, the other stakeholders are questioning why this is taking so long. Jennifer nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of the document that held Richard's future, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. In a kitchen where she kneaded bread at 4 in the morning, in conversations with Tom that had slowly rebuilt her ability to trust, in the mirror where she now saw someone stronger than the woman Richard had thrown away. The power to destroy him sat literally in her hands, but she'd learned during her months of survival that destruction was easy, that the real challenge was choosing grace when you'd earned the right to choose vengeance. Tom had noticed her distraction over the past 2 weeks, the way her mind wandered during their morning conversations. But he'd given her space the same way he'd given her patience, trusting that whatever she was wrestling with would eventually surface. Then one evening, as they sat in a small cafe after she'd closed her bread stand, Jennifer made a decision that terrified and liberated her in equal measure. She told him everything. She watched his face as she explained who she really was, about Richard and the coffee and the exile, about Meridian Holdings and the infrastructure deal and the signature that could make or break the man who'd destroyed her. But Tom's expression never shifted to judgment or shock, only deepening understanding and something that looked remarkably like pride. "So you've been testing me," Tom said quietly. No accusation in his voice, just observation. "Making sure I loved Jennifer the bread seller, not Elena Morrison, the corporate heiress." She started to apologize, to explain her reasons, but he reached across the table and took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "I would have done the same thing." "Actually, I did do the same thing. I never told you that Wellington Investments manages $43 billion in assets because I wanted you to know Tom the man, not Tom the portfolio. We've both been hiding, both been hurt, both been testing whether the other person could love us without the money and the power and all the things that complicate everything." The relief that flooded through Jennifer was physical, her shoulders dropping from tension she hadn't realized she was carrying, but Tom wasn't finished speaking. "The question isn't whether you should destroy Richard's deal," Tom continued, his businessman's mind cutting straight to the strategic heart of the matter. "The question is what destroying it would cost you. Not financially, ethically, emotionally, in terms of who you want to be." Jennifer had been asking herself the same question every night since the baby shower invitation arrived, weighing revenge against redemption. But hearing Tom articulate it, it made something click into place. "I've spent 3 months rebuilding myself from nothing," she said slowly, the words forming as she spoke them. "I've learned that my value isn't determined by Richard's opinion of me, that I'm stronger than I ever was when I had everything handed to me. If I destroy his deal just because I can, I'm letting him define me again. I'm making my choices about him instead of about who I want to become." Tom squeezed her hand gently, his eyes reflecting something that looked like love, deepening into respect, but he pushed one more point that she needed to hear. There's a difference between revenge and consequences, though. If his project has legitimate issues, environmental concerns, financial instability, community impact, then denying it isn't personal, it's responsible. But if it's a solid project that you're blocking purely to hurt him, that's when it costs you something important. Jennifer had already reviewed every page of the environmental and financial reports, had consulted with experts Tom didn't know she'd hired, and the uncomfortable truth was that Richard's project was sound, well-planned, genuinely beneficial to the communities it would serve. Denying it would be pure spite, and spite would poison the person she was becoming, the person Tom had fallen in love with, the person she was learning to love herself. The decision crystallized in that moment, clear and painful and right, but Jennifer realized she could make a choice that wasn't about revenge or approval. She could choose truth. "I'm going to approve the project," she said, watching Tom's expression carefully, needing to see if he understood. "But I'm going to that baby shower, and I'm going to tell Richard exactly who signed off on his deal. Not to destroy him, but to make sure he understands what he threw away, what he never valued, what he'll spend the rest of his life knowing he lost." Tom's smile was slow and genuine, the kind that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. "That's not revenge," he said. "That's justice, and I'd be honored to be there with you when you deliver it." The next 2 weeks passed in a strange mixture of anticipation and peace. Jennifer's mornings still dedicated to her bread stand, but her evenings now spent with Tom, their relationship shifting from careful courtship to genuine partnership built on mutual respect and hard-earned trust. She signed the Meridian approval documents on a Tuesday afternoon, her signature as Elena Morrison officially greenlighting Richard's $70 billion dream, but she requested that the final notification be delayed until the day of the baby shower, wanting the timing to be perfect for reasons the lawyers didn't need to understand. Margaret noticed the change in Jennifer, the way she carried herself with a confidence that went beyond surviving, and one morning before the ovens heated up, the older woman pulled her aside with a knowing smile. "Whatever storm you've been preparing for is almost here," Margaret said, her accent softening the words into something almost musical. "I can see it in how you knead the dough now. Not like you're fighting it, but like you're shaping it into exactly what it's meant to become. That's when I know someone's ready for whatever comes next." Jennifer hugged the woman who'd given her a chance when no one else would, understanding that Margaret had seen through her disguise from the beginning, but had offered dignity instead of questions, work instead of pity. "I'm going to keep the bread stand," Jennifer said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Even after everything settles, even after people know who I really am. This corner, this work, these customers, they showed me who I am when everything else was stripped away. I'm not giving that up." The morning of the baby shower arrived with unseasonable warmth, the kind of spring day that felt like a promise of better things ahead, but Jennifer's stomach churned with nervousness that had nothing to do with the weather. Tom arrived at her apartment at noon, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that reminded her he lived in the same world of wealth she'd been exiled from. But when he looked at her in the simple but elegant dress she'd chosen, expensive enough to signal she hadn't been destroyed, understated enough to show she'd evolved beyond needing clothes to define her worth, his expression told her everything she needed to know. "You're not going there to perform," he said, reading her anxiety with the intuition he'd developed over months of watching her navigate invisible battles. "You're going there to tell the truth. That's all. Just the truth." They arrived at Richard's penthouse, the home that used to be hers, now redecorated to erase any trace of her existence. 15 minutes after the shower's official start time, late enough that most guests would already be settled, early enough that the gift opening spectacle wouldn't have begun. Jennifer's hand trembled slightly as she pressed the elevator button, muscle memory warring with present reality, but Tom's presence beside her was an anchor, steady and undemanding. The doors opened directly into the foyer she'd walked through 1,000 times. But the documents slipped from Richard's fingers and drifted to the floor, landing at Vanessa's feet. But she didn't bend to pick it up because she was staring at Jennifer with an expression that mixed disbelief with the dawning realization that she'd won a battle but lost a war she hadn't known was being fought. The guests remained frozen in their positions, champagne glasses suspended halfway to lips, conversations abandoned mid-breath, everyone understanding they were witnessing something that would be retold in whispered conversations for years to come. Richard's face had gone from pale to flushed, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides as his mind raced through implications that were destroying his carefully constructed narrative of superiority. But what made Jennifer's chest tighten wasn't his humiliation. It was seeing how completely he still didn't understand what he'd actually lost. "You've been playing me this whole time," Richard said finally, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't quite name, anger and shame and confusion battling for dominance. The bread selling, the poverty act, all of it was just a setup so you could have this moment. You let me think you were nothing, so you could destroy me when I was vulnerable. Jennifer heard Tom shift beside her, sensed him preparing to defend her, but she touched his arm gently, needing to handle this herself, needing Richard to hear truth from her lips rather than filtered through someone else's protection. "I wasn't playing anything," she said, and the sadness in her voice surprised even her, the absence of triumph making her words land harder than anger ever could. "I was surviving, Richard. After you threw me out, I had $47 in cash, every account frozen, every friend too afraid of choosing sides to answer my calls. The bread selling wasn't an act, it was the only way I could afford to eat." She watched comprehension flicker across his face, watched him try to reconcile the image of his ex-wife, destitute and desperate with the woman standing before him now, poised and powerful and partnered with someone whose net worth dwarfed Richard's accomplishments. "But you could have used your company, your resources," he protested, grasping for logic that would make her the villain in his version of events. "You let yourself suffer when you had billions at your disposal." Jennifer's laugh was soft and utterly without humor, the sound of someone who'd learned lessons in the hardest classroom existence offered. "I didn't let myself suffer, Richard. You created the suffering when you chose to believe I was worthless. And yes, I could have called Meridian's lawyers that first night, could have moved into a luxury hotel and started rebuilding my public identity immediately. But I needed to know who I was, without the money, without the power, without all the things you married me for instead of marrying me for me." Vanessa's hand had moved protectively to her pregnant belly, her triumph curdling into something that looked suspiciously like fear as she calculated implications Jennifer could see forming behind carefully made-up eyes. "So what happens now?" Vanessa asked, her voice higher than usual, the confidence she'd worn like armor developing cracks. "Are you gonna take everything from us? Destroy Richard's company? Use your power to make sure we lose the baby shower gifts and the penthouse and everything we've built?" The cruelty in the question, the assumption that Jennifer would weaponize a pregnancy and attack an unborn child, was so absurd that several guests gasped audibly, but Jennifer just shook her head slowly, understanding that Vanessa was projecting what she herself would do if their positions were reversed. "I already told you what happens now," Jennifer said, her voice carrying a patience that felt almost maternal, though directed at adults who should have known better. "Your deal is approved. Richard gets his $70 billion in contracts. Your baby will be born into wealth and privilege. I'm not here to destroy you, I'm here to make sure you understand what you actually won." She turned her attention fully to Richard, needing him to hear what came next, needing the words to land in whatever part of him might still be capable of genuine reflection. You won a woman who was willing to sleep with a married man and help break apart his marriage. You won a professional reputation built partially on work I did that you took credit for. You won a life where you'll always wonder if people value you or just what you can give them. That's your victory, Richard. Congratulations. Richard's mouth opened and closed, his usual eloquence deserting him completely. But Tom stepped forward then, his presence somehow making the room feel smaller, his quiet authority reducing Richard's bluster to the insignificance it had always been. "I think what Jennifer is trying to help you understand," Tom said, his tone conversational but carrying an edge that made several guests shift uncomfortably, "is that you didn't just lose a wife when you threw her out. You lost the only person in your life who loved you when you had nothing to offer but yourself. Everything else you have, the money, the deals, the social standing, those things love you back exactly as much as you love them. Which is to say, they're just transactions dressed up as relationships." He paused, letting the words sink in, then delivered the final observation with surgical precision. Jennifer spent 3 months selling bread to survive, building something real with her own hands, learning who she was without any props or pretenses. What have you built, Richard, that isn't just a monument to your own ego? The question hung in the air unanswered because there was no good answer. And Jennifer saw the moment when Richard's anger collapsed into something rawer and more painful. The realization that he'd traded something irreplaceable for something ultimately hollow. But she felt no satisfaction in his pain, only a distant sadness for the man he could have been if he'd valued different things, made different choices, seen the woman beside him instead of just the reflection she provided for his ambitions. "I should go," Jennifer said quietly, the energy draining from the confrontation now that truth had been spoken, leaving only the awkward aftermath of shattered illusions. "I only came to make sure you knew who approved your deal and why. The rest of your life is yours to live however you choose." She turned toward the elevator, Tom's hand finding hers naturally, their fingers interlacing with the ease of two people who'd built something genuine in the ruins of their separate disasters. But Vanessa's voice stopped her at the threshold. "I don't understand," Vanessa said, genuine confusion breaking through her usual polished facade. "If you have all that power, all that money, why were you selling bread? Why didn't you just destroy us immediately and take back everything we took from you?" Jennifer looked back at the woman who'd stolen her husband, seeing not a villain, but just another person, terrified of being ordinary, willing to hurt others to prove she was special, and the pity she felt was complicated and uncomfortable, but ultimately compassionate. "Because revenge would have made me like you," Jennifer said simply, the words landing without malice, just observation. "And I spent 3 months discovering I'm capable of being so much more than that." She didn't wait for a response, just stepped into the elevator with Tom, the doors closing on a room full of people whose judgments no longer had the power to touch her, their whispers fading as the elevator descended toward street level and the life she'd built from flour and water and determination. Tom was quiet until they reached the lobby, respecting her need to process what had just happened. But when they stepped out onto the sidewalk where spring sunshine painted everything gold, he pulled her close and kissed her forehead with a tenderness that made her eyes sting with tears she'd been holding back. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. The words simple but weighted with meaning that went beyond the confrontation upstairs. "You could have destroyed him, could have made him suffer the way he made you suffer, but you chose to be better than that. That takes more strength than revenge ever could." Jennifer leaned into his embrace, letting herself feel the safety of being valued for who she actually was, but her mind was already moving forward, already planning the next chapters of a life that felt like it was finally, genuinely hers. "I need to get to my bread stand," she said, checking her watch and realizing she was already late for her afternoon customers. "People are counting on me, and I'm not going to let them down just because my past tried to catch up with my present." Tom laughed, the sound rich with affection and respect, But he didn't try to talk her out of returning to work that had some people would consider beneath someone with her wealth. "I'll walk with you," he said, understanding without being told that the bread stand wasn't just a business, it was proof that she'd survived. Dear viewers, thank you for joining Jennifer on this powerful journey from devastating betrayal to triumphant self-discovery. This story teaches us that our value isn't determined by how others treat us, that the greatest revenge is becoming someone so transformed that your past can no longer define you, and that true strength is choosing grace over destruction even when you've earned the right to destroy. You've witnessed how underestimating people reveals more about our character than theirs, how survival builds unbreakable foundations, and why treating others with dignity matters even when, especially when, they're at their lowest point. Now it's your turn. Drop in the comments what lessons struck you most deeply from Jennifer's story. What would you have done differently if you were in her shoes selling bread to survive? Would you have approved Richard's deal, or would you have chosen revenge? What moment in the story taught you the most about resilience, forgiveness, or the true meaning of power? Subscribe now for more captivating stories that blend entertainment with life-changing lessons about redemption, justice, karma, and the incredible strength we discover when life strips everything away. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss stories that inspire, challenge, and remind you of the power we all carry within us to rise above our circumstances and become something extraordinary. Thank you for watching, and remember, your circumstances don't define you. Your choices in those circumstances do.